Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 37th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. This will be the final episode on Herod the Great, and thus the last episode of Season 1. Well, probably. Unless I do a couple of recap/bonus episodes, which I might or might not. We'll see. More to come. Maybe. Before diving into this episode, I need to issue a warning. It's long. Normally, if I script something as long as this one, I'd break it up into a couple of parts to keep it manageable for listeners. But I'm conscious that the holidays are upon us, and the idea of having this bleed into 2025 seems to me to be a bit off for some reason. So what follows is the longest episode of this series, and by a decent margin. It might be the last one for a little while, though, so I hope you will listen and enjoy, and of course, please share this. Last time, we traced Herod as he consolidated his power in Judea, cozied up to Augustus, and enjoyed the benefit that came with having so powerful a patron, built a magnificent new trading post and harbor, a stunning feat of engineering and architecture, dusted aside a couple of assassination attempts, and married several women and had a bunch of kids. By the close of the 20s BCE, Herod was firmly in control of his kingdom. To whatever extent such a thing was possible, Herod was considered trustworthy by the Romans and given as much autonomy to do as he pleased within his kingdom. Well, as much as the Romans were capable of granting. Thanks in no small part to the goods and commerce flowing through the port of Caesarea Maritima, the local economy surged, and Herod was able to send lavish gifts and tribute back to Augustus, beautify his kingdom, and enrich his people. Judea was prosperous, and Judea was unusually calm, at least in terms of foreign entanglements. Rome and Parthia had enacted an uneasy truce, and the whole region exhaled and settled in for a period of exhausted peace. He couldn't know it at the time, but by the time the 20s BCE gave way to the 10s, he would have about a decade of stability before an outbreak of war would upend his world once again. Herod put this to good advantage, and in his latter reign was defined principally by the thing he loved doing above all else: building. Judea saw a huge building boom as his frantic energy conceptualized, commissioned, and supervised projects all over the kingdom. Many of these projects had public utility: roads, theaters, markets, etc. But many of his biggest projects had a common theme: his own safety in the event of sudden and violent upheaval. Herod looked back over his career and remembered more troubled times. These periods of chaos were formative to his building program. You may recall that even before Rome appointed Herod king, the upstart governor had fled before the Parthian-backed attempt to seize Judea and to displace the Antipatrids and restore the Hasmoneans. Before leaving the kingdom, Herod had installed his family, including his then young bride-to-be Mariamne I, in the family-fortified palace at Masada. Masada had been a wise choice. It had a long history, and the earliest phases of building and development were conducted by the Hasmoneans. When the Antipatrids rose to power, Masada had fallen into their possession. Equal parts fortress and luxury palace, the complex had been a family stronghold for some time. Located about 60 miles from Jerusalem, Masada sits atop an imposing mesa, with drop-offs of hundreds to more than 1,300 feet on all sides. It is, essentially, a complex on top of a mountain, commanding spectacular views of the Moab Mountains and the Dead Sea. The only approach to the summit complex was by a twisting and very narrow path. This made Masada much easier to defend than attack. Since the place had served as a sanctuary for his family in the past, Herod set his sights on developing both Masada's defenses and luxury amenities, both for his own enjoyment and to ensure a safe place to which he could retreat in case of flare-up of violence either from his own people or a foreign adversary. He had undertaken several projects at Masada over the years. Back in the 35s BCE, Herod had constructed a palace on top of the citadel, complete with a large inner courtyard, elegant shaded porticos, stunning mosaics, and private quarters for him and his family. Of course, no palace would be complete without a throne room, so overawed visitors could bow before the mighty king. This palace is today called the Western Palace. Keep in mind, Masada is in the middle of the desert. It may only rain there but once or twice a year. The engineers that developed the complex built a sophisticated system of drainage and cisterns that it was said 2 days' worth of rain would be enough to provide the complex with 2 to 3 years' worth of water. He again embellished Masada in the mid-20s BCE by constructing more storerooms, cisterns, and the spectacular Northern Palace. This palace was built across 3 tiers and right into the steep cliffs. As a result, the buildings of the Northern Palace hung out over the edge of the mountain, almost clinging to the cliffs. It included private quarters, reception rooms, and a Roman-style bathing complex. This last amenity is worth noting as Herod ushered in a distinct new architectural style, blending elements of native Judean themes with those of the Greeks and the Romans. The architectural program of Herod would contribute greatly to his legacy, or at least it would have, had many or even any of these glorious projects not been faded to oblivion just a few years after his own death. More on that in a bit. The Northern Palace at Masada was a spectacular and grandiose achievement of both architecture and engineering. It's also reflective of the relentless focus and determination of Herod, a man who seemed to bend even the mountains to his iron will. If you do a Google Images search for a recreation or model of the Northern Palace of Masada, you might get a better sense of what I mean. The place was amazing, and yet Herod wanted it even more secure. In 15 BCE, he completed the final phase of his development at the Masada complex. He ringed the entire citadel with a massive set of double walls, barracks, equipment storage, and fortifications. Now, anyone hoping to advance on the mountaintop palace/fortress complex would not only have to march nearly single file up the snaking path, but also contend with towering walls and fortresses and heavily armed defenders. Under Herod's rule, Masada became nearly impregnable, one of the very few places that he felt secure. But this was just one of several ambitious projects. In fact, Masada was one of 7 fortress palace complexes that Herod constructed. It gives you an indication of his mindset. Even when the kingdom was at peace, and even when the populace was quiet, if not always contented, Herod nonetheless anticipated both foreign entanglements and domestic plots, and coups, and unrest. He was always looking around corners, peering into the shadows, anticipating trouble, teetering on the precipice of paranoia. While he built far and wide, 2 more of his projects warrant specific mention. The first of these was a complex he very humbly called the Herodian. Now, I am teasing the poor guy a bit for this tiny little bit of vanity. After all, plenty of rulers we've covered made a habit of naming nearly anything they could in their own name. Consider how many Alexandrias there are out there, about 70. The Herodian is actually the only building project he seems to have named after himself, and it's likely because this is the site within which he intended to include his mausoleum. Unlike Masada, which had periods of development that predate Herod, the Herodian was entirely envisioned by the king, and the site had a deep symbolic meaning, as it was located at or near the site of his victory over the troublesome Antigonus, son of Aristobulus, and the last of the Hasmonean king of Judea. In typical fashion, Herod sought to bend nature to his will. The Herodian complex was, like Masada, built atop a mountain. However, this mountain was a bit different. Masada was built at the top of a mesa, meaning not much had to be graded. The site for the Herodian was a conical mountain, and thus he commanded that the top of the mountain be leveled to create the surface area he needed to create this grand complex. Lopping off the top of a mountain was no small feat, but Herod was never shy on ambition. His engineers, likely aided by the technical know-how of his Roman allies, duly got to work. The earth excavated in the grand project was redeployed to create a large defensive palisade around the summit and within the walls. Herod constructed 4 huge towers, the largest of which was nearly 60 feet per side and likely contained his personal apartments, complete with elegant mosaics and all the trappings of a pleasure palace befitting the great king. The other 3 towers, while slightly smaller, were no less imposing, about 50 feet per side. It says a lot about Herod's mindset that the upper tier of this complex was only accessible by a narrow, rock-cut staircase, perched at the top of a mountain and surrounded by imposing walls that enclosed massive towers with their own thick walls. But the complex wasn't just at the top of the mountain. At its base, Herod constructed a new city. It contained administrative buildings, a synagogue, elegant gardens, even mausoleums, and of course, that mainstay of Herodian complexes, a bathing facility complete with his adored swimming pool. All of this took a lot of water, which was in short supply at the edge of the desert. Herod thus ordered the construction of a complex and expensive aqueduct system to bring in the requisite volumes of water from a natural spring located 4 miles away. These, in turn, supplied the upper tier of the complex as well. Herod made this new city his regional capital, which brought with it legions of administrators and bureaucrats. He also invited a dozen or so closely affiliated families to move in so that he could surround himself with trusted people. When Marcus Agrippa, the second man of Rome and Augustus's most trusted and loyal deputy, visited the city in 15 BCE, Herod ensured a Roman-style theater that could seat 450 spectators was added to the cityscape for Agrippa's enjoyment. The theater still retains much of its original decoration. While the colors have faded over the centuries, it's clear that in its heyday, the decor would have been bright and vibrant, the height of refined culture and typical of the hybrid Judeo-Romano style that typifies Herod's projects. In fact, Herod made a conscious effort to create space within his city so that people from across all the Mediterranean world could feel at home, Jew and Gentile alike. He envisioned, then built, a cosmopolitan city, a polyglot of cultures, languages, religions, and fashions. This was certainly true of Caesarea Maritima as well, and the concept of a multicultural kingdom was something that Herod both believed in and understood to be a practical necessity, given Judea's location within the Roman Empire and all the varied cultures, ethnicities, religions, and commerce that came with it. With Caesarea, Herod commanded the seas to obey his commands. With the Herodian and Masada, he likewise did so with mountains. Raging waters, towering mountains, both obeyed, yielded to his will, and his building projects just continued. And he sure built. In addition to the grand projects at Masada and Herodian, Herod constructed a magnificent winter palace at Jericho, embellished the city with colonnades, gardens, fountains, all kinds of beautifying amenities. But above all, by an order of magnitude, one project stands out above all the others for its scope, ambition, and cultural impact. While most of Herod's building projects were designed either for his personal pleasure or to reflect his vision of a multicultural kingdom, one was built with the Judeans in mind. Caesarea Maritima was built to be a model Roman city, a place at which his patrons could feel perfectly at home. But the city had another purpose, to give the Romans a place to which they could be diverted so that Jerusalem, the sacred, holy capital of Judea and the heart of Judaism, could be as free from meddling Romans as any city could possibly be. By the time of Herod, Jerusalem was already an ancient city, with people having lived in what became the city stretching back from Herod another 3,000 years into the past. It was the cultural and religious home of Judea and of the Jewish people. Judaism, you will recall, was and is the world's first monotheistic religion, and Jerusalem its beating heart. In prior episodes, and particularly those of Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and Darius, we've discussed how the sacred city had been caught up in the warfare and population displacements so often found in the chronologies of period kingdoms. Jerusalem was subject to repeated sieges, sacks, mass deportations, and foreign occupations, time and again, century after century. And yet it was repaired and rebuilt and reoccupied by Judeans time after time. You may recall that one of the deep traumas inflicted on the Judeans was the sacking and destruction not only of Jerusalem in general, but the sacred temple specifically at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar II. The Neo-Babylonian king had forcibly resettled tens of thousands of Judeans into Babylonia, while the city and the temple remained a desolate ruin. Cyrus had released the captive Judeans and given them permission to rebuild the temple. Darius had even kicked in Persian state funds to aid the project, and the second temple was built sometime around 516 BCE. This ushered in a period of Jewish history known as the Second Temple period. As has been discussed at length, the kingdom of Judah and the surrounding territory had undergone several cataclysms over the centuries between the rebuilding of the temple and the rise of Herod. It had certainly suffered damage and sacrilege on several occasions, including by Herod's now partner Rome, which is part of why the festering and justified anger that so many Judeans felt about their king's tolerance of Roman presence in the kingdom lurked beneath the surface. But as the building stood, of enormous spiritual and importance to the Jews, it was a place of common identity, of religious practice, ritual, sacrifice, a place of pilgrimage for the Jewish diaspora, a common place of gathering for a people that had endured so much for so long. Herod, as we've covered, always had an uneasy relationship with the Jewish nobility. Many members of the upper caste of Judean society eyed Herod with suspicion. For his part, Herod eyed everyone with suspicion. Still, he had been raised as a Jew and actively practiced the faith. His tensions with the nobility had less to do with matters of common faith and more to do with the way by which he came to power and his partnership with those meddlesome Romans. By 20s BCE, Herod's construction boom was in full swing, and he was ready to kick off his grandest and career-defining project, a wholesale rebuild of the sacred temple. The building was nearly 500 years old and was definitely showing its age. But Herod had more than a restoration in mind. What he envisioned was a huge, sweeping upgrade, not only to the temple itself, but the entire precinct in which it was situated. He declared to his people his intention to rebuild the sacred temple. But Herod was unpopular with his people, and many were skeptical, even hostile to his plans. There was no trust between king and subjects. Herod's project, while controversial, was an attempt by the king to narrow the breach between him and those he ruled. In order to mollify his restive people, Herod committed that he would not begin construction until all of the building materials that would be required had been acquired and staged. This might not seem to be that big of a commitment, until one considers the vast scale of the project that Herod had in mind. The most sacred area in Jerusalem was and is Mount Moriah. According to Jewish religious custom, this sacred hill was the site of creation and also where Abraham constructed the altar to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. It was on Mount Moriah that King Solomon built the first temple nearly 1,000 years earlier and on which the current temple stood. Given that it was the home to the temple, Mount Moriah was also called the Temple Mount. Herod had more than a renovation in mind, and the grand scale of his vision butted up against the topography of Mount Moriah. The mountain was steep and narrow and did not support a lateral expansion of the building or the surrounding precinct. It would be difficult to fit anything much bigger on the Temple Mount. There simply wasn't enough buildable land. Herod's solution to this challenge was perfectly typical of his vision and creativity. He commanded that the entire mountain be ringed with massive retaining walls, which could then be filled in to create a huge foundation and plaza on which he could build. Imagine building walls around a mountain. The amount of stone and material needed to pull this off is hard to fathom. Thus, given the size and scale of the project that he had in mind, Herod's commitment to have all of the materials pre-arranged would prove to be a considerable logistical accomplishment. The final project would use several hundreds of thousands of stones, and while the average block weighed between 2 and 5 tons, some of the larger stones were 80 tons. That's 160,000 pounds. The amount of labor required to move just one stone was substantial, and again, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. Incidentally, that 80-ton stone mentioned would eventually be put in place some 100 feet above the foundations. So it wasn't just cutting and transporting the stones, but physically placing them with razor-like precision that had to be accomplished by Herod's engineers hundreds of thousands of times. Much of the stone, limestone was the main stone used in the project, was quarried from the hills above Jerusalem. There was a slight assist from gravity in getting the stones to the site of the project, but still, the amount of labor required is staggering. And it wasn't just stone that Herod needed to prove his project would be seen through to completion. He needed carts, pulleys, cranes, rollers, and all the assorted tools, engineering and serving equipment, and draft animals, which Josephus says were 1,000 oxen, needed to haul everything around. Logistically, it's difficult to fathom just how much went into being ready to even start. And aside from all the materiel, what Herod needed more than anything else was people. He needed laborers to work on the project, and he needed engineers with the deep know-how to bring his grand vision to life. The former he accomplished by bringing in 10,000 laborers. If this doesn't sound like a big number, then please consider that the population of Jerusalem at that time was approximately 40,000. So Herod's labor force was fully 25% of the city's population. To put that into perspective, I live in the Atlanta metropolitan area, which has a population of a bit more than 6 million people. Imagine adding another 1.5 million overnight who came to work on a project that would take decades to fully complete. And keep in mind, all this back-breaking labor required vast amounts of energy, all calories that would need to come from feeding, not to mention housing, a huge labor force, and their draft animals. Once he had secured all the requisite materials and satisfied at least some of his critics, work could begin. The giant, and I mean giant, retaining walls began slowly creeping their way around the Temple Mount. The workers built one complete circuit at a time. The walls were to be 16 feet thick. Using gravity, the stones were transported from the upper hill quarries onto the Temple Mount, then lowered into place. Once an entire ring of walls had been completed, called a course of stone, then fill and rubble would be added behind the walls up to the level of the course. This gave workers a platform on which to work as they maneuvered the next course of stones into place. Each new course was set back an inch or two from the one above it, which ensured the strength of the wall as it crept northward with each subsequent course. The stones were placed with such exceptional precision that they were perfectly lined up with the ones next to it. There is no mortar in the wall. The sheer weight of the stones held everything into place. The western wall of the Temple Mount, today also known as the Wailing Wall, which is one of the only original structures of Herod's temple complex still standing, has 8 courses of stone in its foundation alone, more than 40 feet deep, and again 16 feet thick. It rises from the foundations another 60 feet or so. The total estimated height of the wall at this point is 105 feet. Mind you, this huge wall was more than retaining walls and backfill. Within the construction were gateways, passages, staircase, all of which were engineered into the new complex with exceptional precision. One of the stones in the western wall passageway, called the Western Stone, is estimated to be approximately 300 tons or 600,000 pounds. This makes the Western Stone one of the 10 largest stones to ever be quarried, moved, and placed in all of human history. Remember, while certainly not all were this large, there were hundreds of thousands of stones in these walls. As the new wall drew toward completion, the result was a massive plaza at the top of the Temple Mount, upon which the temple and its surrounding buildings could be constructed. So how big was this plaza? Just how much more land did this huge undertaking yield? A lot, as it turned out. The area of the Temple Mount was more than doubled, from roughly 17 to 36 acres. To put this size in context, this created a surface area of more than 1.5 million square feet, or more than 27 American football fields. To drive home the point, you could plop the Great Pyramid of Giza in the middle of this platform and have roughly 500 feet of all sides to the edge to spare. The section of the western wall that survives is a little less than 200 feet long. Just that side of the wall alone would have been over 1,600 feet long, over a quarter mile, and that's one side. This was a huge, huge development, and the work went on day and night, year after year, excepting only the sacred periods of rest to observe the Sabbath and other holy days. The plaza was divided into 4 courtyards, which were all separated from one another and which each served a different purpose. The main plaza was known as the Court of the Gentiles, and it was open to all people, Jews and non-Jews alike, Judeans and foreigners, men and women. It was here that people could intermingle, buy animals for sacrifice, and exchange money to reflect the various cultures and commerce being conducted in Herod's capital. The Court of the Gentiles was the outermost courtyard of the temple complex, and it surrounded on all sides the remaining 3 courtyards: the Court of the Women, the Court of Israel, also called the Court of Men, and the Court of the Priests. These sacred courtyards were strictly for Jewish persons, and were separated from the Court of the Gentiles by a wall that had several gates that led to the sacred inner precincts. These gates had posted notices that said that any foreigners or uncircumcised persons were forbidden to enter, and failure to heed these notices was punishable by death. We know this not only from the ancient sources, but because one of these notices actually survives and is in a museum in Istanbul. As might be expected, each of these courts served a specific purpose. The Court of the Women was, you guessed it, a place of worship for women. The Court of Israel was for the men of Judea, and the Court of the Priests, the most sacred and most strictly controlled from an access point of view, was for the priests to perform holy rites and sacrifices. These inner courtyards of the temple precinct were paved with brilliantly colored marbles, sourced from all over the world. They were cut with exquisite precision and laid in intricate geometric patterns. Much scholarship in archaeology has been dedicated to recreating the stonework, and I know this is an audio format, so you have to take my word for it, but the results were breathtaking. As the plaza neared completion and the courtyards laid out, walled off, and beautified, the new and expanded plaza had risen to meet the level of the old temple and its precinct. The focus could shift on rebuilding the temple itself. But before the first stone could even be put into place, Herod's temple building project faced a significant obstacle right from the outset. In order to complete the project, the old building would have to be demolished. But if this happened, then the Jews would be without their sacred temple, which simply wasn't an option, as it would render the Jews without the central and sacred home of God. How can you build a temple if you can't also tear down the old one? Of course, Herod wasn't going to let such a challenge interfere with his grand plan. But in engaging with the Judean community and the Jewish priests and scholars, Herod demonstrated a level of tact and diplomacy that may have even surprised some of his critics. Herod took great pains to ensure that his project was done with the approval of even his harshest critics. As mentioned, the first thing he had done was reassure the Judeans that he would only begin construction once he had secured all the resources necessary to see the project through from start to finish. But no matter how much cash he could pour into the project, no matter how much limestone, marble, gold, timber, etc., he gathered, the very presence of the laborers themselves posed a threat to the spiritual welfare of the Jews. Some of the structures of this complex would be deeply sacred. The very presence of physical laborers within and around the temple would render the new building itself ritually unclean. There were to be parts of the building, the innermost courtyards and structures, that only priests could enter. To solve for this, Herod struck upon a novel innovation. He trained priests to be masons and carpenters. Not just a few priests, mind you, but 1,000 were taught the skills necessary to bring the project to life. This accomplished an important goal. While this gave Herod additional high-skilled labor to begin construction on the core building at the heart of the project, it also allowed ritually pure workers to complete the most sacred and holy parts of the temple, keeping the project on track and keeping Herod in the good graces of the social and religious elite. Training priests as masons allowed Herod to ensure the most delicate aspects of the project were conducted with great care, tact, and respect for Jewish law and custom. These priestly laborers kicked off the project by first building within the complex the most sacred parts of the new temple. Only once this work was complete, and in strict accordance with the specifications laid down in Holy Scripture, could the rest of the old building be pulled down, the site cleared, and the rest of the project undertaken. Through this careful sequencing, Herod and his priestly construction team ensured that the Jewish people would not be without a sacred and pure place of worship. God could continue to be present in the temple, even as the complex all around it underwent some serious changes, and the 5-century-old building was pulled down to make room for the grand edifice. Around the perimeter of the Temple Mount, Herod constructed shaded porticos, shopping markets, civic buildings, and a spectacular basilica called the Royal Stoa. The word basilica has come to have a connotation with Christian churches, but in the ancient world, a basilica was a kind of long, colonnaded building for civic functions, such as shopping and law courts. The Royal Stoa was, like Herodian projects, huge. It ran the length of one of the walls of the Temple Mount, and it was 3-sided with the front open to allow people to come and go. The building had a massive, intricately decorated ceiling, held up by 4 rows of 40 columns each, with a central nave vaulted to a tremendous height. All told, the building had 162 columns, each hewn from a single stone. These columns were so huge that it would take 3 men to join their outstretched arms around one. Josephus, the greatest historian of ancient Judean history, described the building as a forest of columns, and further said of the Royal Stoa that the building deserved, quote, to be mentioned better than any other under the sun, close quote. While the building was intended for secular use, it did give the Sanhedrin, that council of Jewish elders and judges that had caused so much trouble for Herod early in his career, an appropriate place to convene once their meeting hall was demolished as part of the rebuild. The Royal Stoa was the largest and most spectacular building constructed by Herod. And while it would be demolished by the Romans a bit down the line, it was to be the largest building to have ever been built in Israel all the way into modern times. Access to the Temple Mount was tightly controlled by monumental gates built into the walls with stairways up through the interior and up to plaza level. There was also a huge arch built over the street level, complete with a broad, wide, monumental staircase that allowed Judeans to pass over the busy commercial streets at the foot of the Temple Mount and access the royal stoa. When Judeans passed through the gates, climbed the staircase up to the plaza, and emerged, they would have been dazzled by the light, the scale, and the sheer beauty. The plaza, paved with the finest stones and laid with intricate precision. The stoa, resplendent and beautiful. The largest, most spectacular building anyone had ever seen. Another wall with giant gates into the inner courtyards of the temple precinct, and then finally to the great building itself. The building had a wide, broad facade, complete with giant cast metal doors, and it tapered toward the back, reminding the locals of the shape of a resting lion. The giant doors were framed with gold leaf forged to look like an elegant, beautiful, heavenly grapevine growing up and around the door. Gold architectural features were arrayed across the roof, almost as though the building had been crowned by God himself. The temple was huge, approximately 150 feet tall and enclosing an area twice the size of any temple in Rome at that time. It was beautiful, elegant, and despite its size, it was completed in just a year and a half. Herod's temple was the largest temple project of the classical world and the largest sacred temple precinct constructed anywhere in the ancient world. A spectacular accomplishment that left all that viewed it breathless. Despite his rocky relationship with the religious and social elites, Herod had provided all Jews everywhere, a place to come and worship, side by side, a common place to house and glorify God. Of course, Herod never lost sight of who his patrons were. It was Rome, after all, that had granted his throne, reconfirmed and expanded his power, and served as the hegemon to which all local leaders needed to pay obeisance. As such, to signal to Rome that Herod knew the score, he had a giant golden eagle erected atop the great gate to the temple. Likewise, he connected a military fortress to protect the Temple Mount. The Antonia Fortress was a large citadel akin to a medieval castle, and it housed, among other things, the ceremonial vestments of the chief priests and a significant portion of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. Once again, with this fortress, Herod saw no distinction between intermingling the sacred with what, to many Judeans, was the profane presence of Roman soldiers, just as long as those soldiers stuck to the court of the Gentiles and away from the sacred inner courtyards of the Temple Mount, and of course, out of the temple itself. There is controversy surrounding when this building was constructed. On one hand, it was integrated into Herod's new Temple Mount complex, so it could have been built as part of this grand project. On the other hand, the name suggests it was actually built earlier, when Mark Antony was still the dominant Roman in the eastern Mediterranean and the friend and patron of Herod. In fact, we mentioned the construction of the Antonia Fortress in an earlier part of this series. Thus, in this scenario, the citadel was an existing structure that was linked to the new expanded Temple Mount. It seems strange that Herod would have named the fortress Antonia after Augustus was the victor in the Civil War. Whether it was built before Herod's project or as part of it, the soldiers of Rome were now housed in a mighty fortress connected to the most sacred site in Jerusalem. While this surely raised some eyebrows, or raised some ire, the Roman soldiers could be close at hand if Herod needed Roman intervention in case of any uprisings from his not always thrilled with their king Judeans. Herod's temple complex was a spectacular accomplishment, and given the scale of the construction, the project was completed with extraordinary speed. Construction dates are hard to nail down, but a reasonable estimate of the timeline puts the project at approximately 10 years, from 20 BCE to 10 BCE. By this time, 10 BCE, things were going reasonably well. His reign as king, and even before that, his time as governor and Roman-appointed tetrarch, had started with tremendous chaos, violence, and instability. In his personal life, he'd had a few rocky marriages and a few less problematic ones. He'd banished one wife and son, executed another wife, and systematically worked to eliminate all male Hasmoneans, with the goal of ensuring a clear path not just for his own rule, but for subsequent generations of the Antipatrid dynasty. For the past decade or so, things had been pretty quiet. In fact, at some point, in or before 17 BCE, he had even restored his long-banished first wife Doris, and their son Antipater, Herod's firstborn, and the namesake of his beloved father and the founder of the dynasty, Antipater the Idumean. In 13 BCE, Herod seen enough of his firstborn son, often referred to in history as Antipater II, to name him as his primary heir. The will that laid out the king's plans for succession thus replaced an earlier document in which his sons by Mariamne I, Alexander and Aristobulus, had been named as co-heirs. These sons had been away from the capital for some time, with the boys having been sent to be raised and educated in Rome. By 12 BCE, both boys had been recalled to Judea to rejoin the household of their father. Antipater was about 33 years old at the time that he rose to the top of the pecking order. Herod was nonplussed with how things unfolded when Aristobulus and Alexander returned to Judea. The boys had been away from the kingdom for a long time and had joined prestigious positions as foreign princes in Augustus's court and household. Unlike their father, who never had the benefit of a regal and classical education, the princes had been raised by the finest tutors, and in addition to their considerable knowledge, had been reared on the syrupy manners of the Roman court life. To them, their father was an uncouth provincial, and what they saw as his rough manners and plain speak horrified their imperial snobbishness. To Herod, the boys had grown haughty and insufferable, having forgotten their roots and utterly lacking in the deference that they should show him as their father and their king. After all, neither would enjoy such prestige positions if it wasn't for the deft and occasionally brutal hand that Herod had played in gaining and securing his power. To make matters worse, they were Hasmonean by virtue of their mother, the long dead and still lamented Mariamne I, and so many Judeans saw them as more legitimate rulers than even their own father the king. And they were handsome. They carried an air of dignity and self-assurance that, when coupled with their good looks, gained the young princes wild popularity with the Judeans. For those that had never really accepted Herod, given his Arab and Idumean background, Alexander and Aristobulus offered the tantalizing possibility that through them, by virtue of their mother's lineage, Hasmoneans could once again rule the kingdom. Their demotion at the expense of their older half-brother may have rankled Herod's younger sons of Mariamne I, but for the time being, they kept any concerns to themselves. But the friction between Herod and his Hasmonean sons made conditions at the palace tense. So things were superficially calm within Herod's household, and there was peace in the region too, with Rome and Parthia managing their tenuous and suspicious calm. His people were either begrudgingly accepting of his rule or cowed into submission by a combination of fear of Herod's extensive spy network and awareness of the horrific fates of anyone suspected plotting against the king. Well, likely it was both. Still, Herod had been there to alleviate the suffering of the people during the ravages of drought and famine. The country was more prosperous than anyone could remember, and Jerusalem sparkled with gold, marble, and brilliant limestone. In addition to his monumental temple complex, he'd embellished the city with all sorts of civic amenities, new housing, and of course, palaces. He also constructed a new aqueduct to bring in a steady supply of fresh, clean water to the city, its fountains, and its people. He had even extended his largesse internationally. When the Olympic Games had faced something akin to bankruptcy, Herod stepped in and personally financed the event so the ancient tradition could continue. Herod even contributed to building projects in other foreign cities like Damascus and Beirut. He had built far and wide across his kingdom and even beyond. He was a great patron of the arts and effortlessly fused Greco-Roman and Judean styles into something wholly new and unique. No matter what they thought of him, the Judean elite appreciated the new aesthetic that Herod ushered in. Not only was he a powerful king, but also Herod was unquestionably a tastemaker, setting the look and feel for his people and his kingdom. He had a sophisticated eye and a truly refined and cosmopolitan aesthetic. His kingdom had enjoyed a decade of calm, internally and internationally, and the building boom had brought about a surge in economic productivity. Herod might have been criticized for his partnership with and subservience to Rome, but he'd managed to gain a measure of latitude to operate the kingdom as he saw fit. And just in case things went sideways, Herod had constructed his magnificent fortress/palace complex at Masada, the Herodian, and Jericho. So as the temple project concluded, Herod could bask in the glory of his crowning accomplishment. As so often happens in history, Herod would be cursed to live just long enough to see it all start to come unraveled and to suffer his own descent into madness. Things began to go wrong for Herod right as his two grandest projects were completed. The temple complex was sanctified and opened in 10 BCE. Caesarea, the massive harbor, international culture center, and trading entrepot, was fully completed and consecrated in 9 BCE. In or around 10 BCE, Herod was in his early 60s. Rather than enjoy a nice, quiet final few years, trouble began flaring up all around him. Things began to go sideways with an international conflict as war broke out with the Nabateans. Mind you, Herod's mother had been a Nabatean princess, and the Nabateans had been a frequent ally of Herod and his family for decades. The cause of this conflict is obscure, but one dire consequence of it to Herod was that Augustus was furious with Herod over the outbreak of war, as any instability in the region threatened to upend the delicate peace with the Parthians, the current dynasts controlling Persia. Augustus withdrew his favor from Herod, and the loss of this patronage was a huge blow to the king. After all, everything flowed from and through Rome. Within a year, Herod began to fear for his life from within his own household. His sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, had indeed been discontented with their older half-brother's restoration to grace and investiture as the prime heir, and they still seethed at Herod's murder of their mother, Mariamne I, and they longed for revenge. Or at least, this was the opinion of Herod's sister Salome. We haven't encountered her in a while, but you may remember her as the prime architect of the downfall of Herod's beloved Mariamne I, and subsequently that of Mariamne I's mother, the Hasmonean princess Alexandra the Maccabee, and of Salome's own husband, Costobarus. She was ferocious in protecting the throne of her brother and in advancing her own interests as well as those of her children and grandchildren. Salome was every bit as cunning and prone to paranoia as Herod. She liked to operate in the shadows, watching, listening, and whispering her suspicions into the ears of her always prone to suspicion brother. Just a couple of years after the princes Alexander and Aristobulus had returned to Judea, Salome began to suspect them of attempting to overthrow their father and placing themselves in control. The public would likely have been all too happy for such a turn of events, given their royal bloodlines and public personas. Their inability to act with deference to Herod certainly didn't help, and between their haughtiness, his sister's whispers, and his fundamental paranoia, a breach with the boys seemed to have been inevitable. In Herod's defense, though, it does seem as though there was more than paranoia at play. The boys do seem to have been plotting against their father and made overtures to the leadership of the Judean army, feeling them out to gauge their support in the event of a coup. No matter how much truth there was to a conspiracy, what ultimately mattered was that Herod believed there was one afoot, and in 8 BCE, he had his sons arrested and imprisoned on suspicion of treason. But at first, he didn't act. In this plot to overthrow him, Herod saw an opportunity to address the biggest threat to his throne. Herod appealed to Augustus and shared with the emperor the news of the plot against him. He asked for Augustus's permission to put his sons on trial. This act of deference, this reminder that Herod still looked to Augustus for permission, for the right to rule, won the emperor back over, and he and Herod reconciled. Augustus granted his permission for Herod to put the boys on trial. In 7 BCE, Herod submitted the boys to a trial in the city of Beirut. The trial and court proceedings were all done in accordance with the Roman legal practices, a further reminder that it was Rome, not Judea, that held ultimate power of life and death over even Judean royalty. Alexander and Aristobulus were duly convicted of treason, and Herod oversaw the execution of his sons by Mariamne I by strangulation. He didn't stop there. The princes had made overtures to the military, and Herod believed that at least some of the leaders of the army had been swayed to their cause. Just to be sure that no coup would survive the young men's death, also in 7 BCE, Herod had 300 leaders from the military rounded up and executed en masse. A threat to his rule had been eliminated, and as always, Herod somehow managed to navigate the turbulent waters and come out stronger on the other side of the troubles. Rome was back in his corner. In particular, the friendship between Herod and Augustus had been restored. But Herod was in steep decline, and his mental and physical health was deteriorating rapidly. By 6 BCE, Herod's world fell deeper into chaos when he faced growing resistance from the Pharisees, a group of Jewish scholars and priests who followed religious law with strict adherence. This group had tended to look askance at the faith of Herod, and before that, his father Antipater, because the Idumeans had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Sadducees, another Jewish sect, all those years ago. We mentioned the rift between the Pharisees and the Sadducees an episode or two back. To the Pharisees, this forced conversion, which may have happened decades before Herod was even born, still rendered his faith invalid, and they considered him to be not Jewish. Thus, it is no surprise that the leadership of the Pharisees had always had a rocky relationship with Herod. And while most Judeans, and for that matter Romans and other foreigners, marveled at the new temple and the Temple Mount, the Pharisees found the whole project revolting, an affront to tradition. Couple that with Herod's active partnership with Rome, and the Pharisees had grown increasingly vocal in their critique of the king, going so far as to prophesy that Herod would lose his throne and that none of his children would inherit the kingdom. In the past, perhaps, Herod could have taken pains to seek resolution, or at least a measure of understanding. He tended to respond violently to conspiracies and coups, but he hadn't tended to overreact to criticism. By this point, however, Herod was aged, increasingly infirm, and in a steady decline of his faculties of reason and self-control. Backed by his renewed endorsement from Rome, Herod ordered that the leaders of the Pharisees be seized and executed. Their crime was to be critical of Herod, but that was all it took. This had the effect of silencing the remaining Pharisees, but it did nothing to help Herod endear himself to the populace. Between the death of his Hasmonean sons and the murder of his religious critics, what goodwill Herod had managed to claw together over his decades on the throne was coming unraveled quickly and violently. And things were about to get worse. By 5 BCE, Herod's oldest son, Antipater, was named as his heir. Perhaps seeing his father losing his grip on reality and descending into a paranoid, blood-soaked final act, Antipater began scheming against Herod. Had he been patient, nature surely would have taken its course in due time, and Antipater would have been able to take control. But who knows how long the old man would hang on, and by then, it would be hard to tell what would be left. Those around Herod understood that his paranoia was devolving into violent madness, and it seems as though Antipater was a little too eager to take the reins. By one means or another, word got to Herod that Antipater was plotting against him. The outcome is not surprising. Once again, Herod appealed to Rome, and Augustus granted his permission for Herod to proceed as he saw fit. Herod thus ordered his own son condemned to die, now the third of his own sons to be killed on suspicion of conspiracy. In place of Antipater, Herod named Herod Antipas, his son by his fourth wife Malchus, as his heir. These events all took a toll on Herod. Not that he deserves much sympathy, but it's worth noting that by the time Antipater joined his younger half-brothers in death, Herod was gravely ill and in excruciating pain. This, in turn, furthered his violence and madness, and he was unstable, unpredictable, dangerous to be around. At some point in the closing act of his life, Herod made a final journey to his winter palace in Jericho. With so many of his heirs dead, Herod again revised his will. Rather than focus on a sole heir, Herod divvied up his kingdom, naming Herod Archelaus Ethnarch, a position once held by Hyrcanus II, the Hasmonean high priest, and briefly king, in whose service Herod's father had risen to power. The Ethnarch was a political leader to a people of common ethnicity. Herod then named sons Herod Antipas, one of his sons by Malchus, his fourth wife, to serve as tetrarch along his half-brother Philip, who was the son of Herod, with his fifth wife, Cleopatra of Jerusalem. Even Salome, his ever-scheming sister, received a governorship within the kingdom via a position called toparch. There was a sort of hierarchy to this arrangement, with Salome, Philip, and Herod Antipas each intended to rule over a position or territory, while Herod Archelaus oversaw the region as a kind of ethnic supervisor. The roles of ethnarch, tetrarch, and toparch don't really have modern equivalents, but this division of power helped stabilize the chaotic succession crisis that befell Herod in his final years. It was a convoluted settlement, and perhaps Herod hoped that the boys would each be focused on their respective spheres of influence and stop trying to overthrow their dad, with Salome around to do what she did so well: keep an eye and an ear open to detect any conspiracies before they could take root. It worked well enough, as this would eventually be the settlement in place when Herod died, and die he would soon enough. But first, both he and his people were fated to suffer further. Him from his gruesome illness, which drove him mad with pain. His flesh was decaying even as he lived on. And this is mostly a family-friendly show, but let's just say that a form of gangrene seems to have taken place in some very delicate parts. In 4 BCE, perhaps sensing that the king was dying, A couple of Pharisee teachers chose this time to foment an act of rebellion. As part of his temple project, and as mentioned, Herod had ordered a golden eagle statue to be mounted atop the main ceremonial gate into the temple courtyards. The eagle was a symbol of Rome and of their military might. This was, rightfully, offensive to some, so close to the sacred temple, especially the strictly traditional Pharisees. Given the prohibition on graven images, a few zealous Pharisee teachers encouraged students to take action against this effrontery, and 40 students stormed the Temple Mount, climbed the Great Gate, and chopped the eagle down from its perch with axes. Of course, this panicked Herod, who was always verging on paranoia, and he was worried that the Romans would see this as a symbolic act of resistance to and defiance of Rome. Herod did not first seek permission from Augustus over his course of action. He acted swiftly and with brutality. He had all of the students seized, as well as the 2 teachers who had catalyzed this act of rebellion with their acid words. Herod then had them all burned alive. Even as he writhed in pain on his deathbed, Herod kept ordering killings. Never confident in his acceptance by the Jewish elite, Herod now ordered a large contingent of that group to be herded to Jericho, where Herod was slowly and excruciatingly dying. He gave orders that when he died, this large group of Jewish noble hostages would all be slaughtered. Sources suggest his motivation was that he feared that he would not be mourned when he died, and that when these prestigious members of Judean society were killed, then there would be sadness and mourning in the kingdom. As the end came for Herod, he was driven mad with pain. Writhing in agony, he ordered further deaths and executions. His final few days have been described as an insane bloodlust. At one point, Herod grabbed a fruit knife and tried to kill himself to put a stop to his pain, but the knife was too dull, and in his weakened state, he couldn't carry out his desperate act. He was subdued by his retainers, but he had just 5 days left to live. Indeed, Herod died in 4 BCE after an excruciating illness that his critics called Herod's evil. It was seen by many as God's judgment and condemnation. The king, whose life was so full of drama, paranoia, betrayal, controversy, and style, taste, opulence, grandiosity, was finally dead, aged 69 or 70. Herod's sister Salome, ferocious by her brother's side in life, defied his dying wish and released the Jewish nobility from their captivity, sparing their life and sparing her brother from another horrific stain on his crumbling legacy. Herod's body was marched with great solemnity to the Herodion, the palace, fortress, pleasure city, and mausoleum he had spent so much time and energy building. It was the only building project he named after himself, and it was to be his eternal resting place. And maybe it still is. People have been looking for a long time. The king's tomb has not been definitively identified, nor has his golden coffin been discovered. Perhaps he's awaiting rediscovery, or perhaps he finally knows peace. So, what on earth are we to make of this guy? Let's dive straight in to one of the most notorious stories from his life. Many people first encounter Herod from biblical accounts, in particular those of the Christian New Testament. In the stories associated with the Nativity, Herod is portrayed as jealous and fearful of the infant Jesus. In one account, 3 holy men travel to Judea, having received word that a child had been born in Bethlehem that was destined to become king of the Jews. They bring this word to Herod, who asks them to find the boy and bring word back to him so that he can also pay homage. These 3 magi, whom you will remember from our episodes on the great Persian kings, were Zoroastrian priests. They understood that Herod intended to kill the young rival, and as such they depart for their country through another route. Enraged, Herod then orders all males in Bethlehem under the age of 2 to be killed. In particular, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 6 through 18 states that, quote, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Close quote. I suspect that more than one listener has been patiently waiting for this story and wondering why it never came up when we told the story of Herod. The simple reason is that the massacre of the innocents, as this event has come to be called, likely never happened. There were nearly 100 years between these events described in the Gospel of Matthew and when this book was written. This doesn't necessarily mean the Gospel is unreliable, but it does caution us to look to other sources to gauge the historicity of these events. None of the other canonical Gospels, those of Mark, Luke, and John, make even a passing reference to such events. Neither do any of the other period chroniclers, such as Josephus and Nicholas of Damascus. The absence of such references to such a horrific killing casts doubt that it ever happened. Many of the chroniclers, including all referenced here, took delight in casting Herod in a negative light, often barely hiding their hostility to him and taking every opportunity to pass along any stories that further eroded his reputation. If any group of people had an incentive to retell such a horrific tale, then it would be these guys. And yet, they don't, and that is quite telling. The Gospel of Matthew draws heavily on the earlier and older Gospel of Mark. In fact, Matthew restates or reproduces approximately 90% of Mark, and Mark makes no mention of such a horror. Adding up the evidence, it seems unlikely that the massacre of the innocents ever happened. Mind you, this does not absolve Herod of his bloodthirsty and paranoid reputation. In fact, a story like this could only take hold if people had found it consistent with Herod's character and actions. Especially in his final few years, Herod was clearly a combination of violence and frenzied paranoia. The story of the massacre of the innocents thus is planted in very fertile soil. In assessing Herod's life and career, these last few years require specific attention. And until his final trip to Jericho, there were plenty of assets on the balance sheet, so to speak. So how and why did Herod descend into such a bloodthirsty madness at the end? The frantic orders of deaths and execution that flowed out from Herod's deathbed can be considered not a favorable light, but at least partially explained through science. It's always a dicey proposition to try to diagnose illness thousands of years later. But in this case, we owe a debt of gratitude to Josephus. The historian took great care to document the physical and psychiatric symptoms that afflicted the dying king, including depression, paranoia, abdominal pain, vicious itching, shortness of breath, and difficulty and pain in moving his limbs. Unlike some vague ancient descriptions of illness that invite a lot of speculation, such as was the case with Alexander the Great, the level of detail in Josephus, the specific enumeration and description of so many specific symptoms paints a very clear picture. These symptoms line up precisely with acute kidney failure. The cumulative effect of this disease is that the kidneys cannot process waste, and in effect, the body slowly poisons itself. And for some of the other symptoms, it seems likely that the dying king was also afflicted with genital gangrene. It hurt just saying those two words. His maddened, even frenzied state does not excuse his deathbed violence, but at least we can understand that he wasn't fully in control of all of his mental or physical faculties. Again, explanations are not excuses, but there does seem to be a reasonable explanation for why the final years of Herod's life grew increasingly violent and chaotic. Now, if you've listened to this series, you might have noticed that the recap of Herod's life and career is a bit different than others. Generally, I start back at the beginning and work my way forward in the recap, but here I've started right at his death. And there is a very specific reason for this, and that is that the last 4 years of his life, from about 8 BCE until he finally succumbed to his gruesome illness in 4 BCE, stand out. There is a clear before and after. And since this series focuses on people called the Great, it seems like we should definitely closely examine the time in his life when he was anything but. Those final 4 years undid a lifetime of careful planning, deft navigation of turbulent political waters, and grand vision and ambition unlike any king in his country's long history. So in a way, by dealing with the end-of-life horrors first, we can spend a few minutes exploring the balance of his career, which was controversial to be sure, but at least counts some positives in the ledger. Herod had been criticized for his pro-Roman politics, with some using terms like collaborator or traitor to his people. We can laugh off this critique. Rome at the time was a surging superpower. In a choice between cooperate or get obliterated, Herod made the only reasonable choice for himself, for his people, and for his kingdom. Within his family and his inner circle, he was undoubtedly paranoid. But from the macro view, from the big picture vantage point, he was a pragmatist. Resistance to Rome was suicide and likely would have led to another dark chapter in Judea's long history of foreign conquests, slaughter, and pillage. By cozying up to the Romans, Herod sought to optimize the outcome of the only choice he could really make. Above all, Herod's greatest accomplishment and the greatest argument for his epithet of the Great comes from his building program. He was Judea's greatest builder and one of the greatest builders of all time. He rivaled any ancient ruler for the scale of his building program. He built on mountains, he built in valleys, he built the length of his kingdom, and even, thanks to his largesse, within foreign territories. His palace fortresses at Masada, Jericho, and the Herodian are genuinely stunning feats of engineering. These places also sum up his life and career. He both fortified and beautified, a dichotomy perfectly embodied within Herod himself. Of course, in thinking about building a palace atop a mountain such as Masada, or even building a mountain itself as at the Herodian, it's natural to consider the astounding cost of such constructions. While these projects were expensive and Herod was using state revenues to finance them, it's worth pointing out that he was also pouring money back into local economies, hiring laborers, engineers, architects, artisans, teamsters, masons, and so on. Employment was high, wages surged. Herod's motivations may have been, in fact likely were, driven by vainglory, but it shouldn't be discounted that in addition to a relatively prolonged period of peace, Herod's rule brought a measure of prosperity. Peace and prosperity is a good combination for a legacy. The cost of these programs was also offset in part by the surging economic activity that resulted from Herod plugging Judea into the global network of trade. In large part due to Caesarea Maritima, the economy boomed, and while many Judeans were paying more in taxes for their king's grand projects, they also reached new levels of prosperity and influence. Herod indeed drew a fair degree of criticism for the amount of taxes that he levied, and he was accused in his day and by subsequent historians of putting hefty tax burdens on his people, given the elevated prosperity of his kingdom, and this critique can be waved off as post facto hand-wringing. In fact, at several points, Herod consciously lowered or waived outright tax obligations. Of course, above all, the most important project was the Temple Mount and the newly rebuilt temple. While this was not without critique from traditionalists, even harshly critical historians such as Josephus are careful to give the king credit for the beauty, elegance, scale, and taste of the new complex. The royal stoa was considered to be one of the most spectacular architectural accomplishments of the ancient world. The magnificent courts and their elegant pavements were unlike anything ever erected in Judea. And as for the central building, the temple itself, the Talmud, a sacred text of Jewish law and theology, says, quote, "Whoever has not seen Herod's temple has not seen a beautiful building in his lifetime." Close quote. This complex gave Jews an exalted and beautified spiritual home and gave Jews and Gentiles alike a place to convene, intermingle, conduct commerce, and engage in peaceful exchange. For many contemporaries and historians alike, this intermingling itself was problematic. But Herod was a pragmatist. He understood that ethnic and religious isolation was neither possible nor preferable. He was as ambitious as anyone we've covered in this series, but he also understood that Judea was a bit player as compared to his powerful neighbors Rome and Parthia. There was only so much independence any kingdom would ever be able to enjoy. Despite the vocal and frequent critique of Herod for his partnership with Rome, the new king knew Judea had little choice. He deserves credit for maximizing the outcome of an otherwise unideal situation, rather than critique that he faced such a reality in the first place. The alternative would be revolt against Rome and an invitation to the chaos and destruction that would surely follow. After all, Herod was alive for Pompey's conquest of the city, and of Crassus's desecration from and theft of the temple, and of the Holy of Holies. No matter how much some of the Judeans longed for independence from Rome and the elimination of foreigners from the kingdom, such isolationism just wasn't possible without simultaneously inviting dire circumstances. Herod understood this and had the foresight to manage accordingly, even as he absorbed critique from certain members of Judean society. In time, much of the critique that had come his way had been softened or muted in light of his architectural accomplishments. If only Herod had been able to ride out the end of his life basking in the accumulated glory of his spectacular building projects. He likely still would have been remembered as a complex and divisive figure, but at least some people would be making the case for him. Unfortunately, for Herod's quest to leave behind a great legacy, he had a big obstacle that would prove difficult to overcome: himself. The violence and frenzied killing that marked his final few years was and is a stain that could never be erased or overlooked. Don't get me wrong, it's not like this guy was gentle and pacifist up until these final few years. In fact, the contrary is absolutely true. Conspirators, real and imagined, family members, even wives and children had all died on Herod's command long before his end-of-life madness. He was a violent man in violent times. The paranoia at the end of his life was just an extreme of a tendency he had shown throughout his career. The willingness to order death, in ones, in twos, or in the hundreds, was likewise only different from his earlier life in terms of its scale and seeming arbitrariness. A close look at Herod's life suggests the last person he truly trusted was his brother Fazil, whom Herod outlived by 3.5 decades. His sister Salome had his ear, but she was all too willing to whisper conspiracies and play into his basic paranoia. Herod saw the world through suspicion. He was, at his core, paranoid. Get too close to the king, and you were as likely to end up dead as you were to enjoy the benefits of his favor. Herod was, right up until the end, a paradox. He was calculating and logical, but ambitious and imaginative. He could act with great tact and diplomacy, and he could callously order the horrific deaths of people that he suspected were arrayed against him. He glorified and exalted the Jewish faith through his temple project, and he murdered and persecuted the Pharisee priests, teachers, and scholars. The peace and stability of his kingdom was his greatest legacy. Blood, paranoia, and murder were the greatest stains on it. As we close, it's worth considering how we know so much about Herod. For this, we owe a debt of gratitude to the historian Josephus. I promised much earlier in this series that we would take a moment to consider who this guy was. While undoubtedly a gifted scholar, Josephus is not always reliable, but he was deeply prolific. Thanks to Josephus, we have more details of Herod's life and career than of any of the people we've discussed so far. Josephus was a Judean general in a great rebellion against Rome in the late 60s CE during the concluding years of the reign of the Emperor Nero and the beginning of yet another Roman civil war, known as the Year of Four Emperors. He was captured and served as a kind of cultural advisor to the top of the Roman command, leading the Roman response to what historians have come to call the First Jewish-Roman War. In time, Josephus struck up friendships with the Roman command structure and was eventually granted citizenship. These were good friends to have. One, the general Vespasian, left his son in charge of suppressing the revolt while he made his successful bid for the Roman throne. In 70 CE, that son, Titus, sacked Jerusalem and in the process razed the Second Temple, Herod's monumental accomplishment, to the ground. The work of Josephus in many ways helped legitimize his patrons and to remind his home country of the folly of rebelling against Rome. Herod, Josephus reminds us, stayed loyal, and he and his country reaped the rewards. His successors foolishly rebelled, and they lost what little freedom they had and endured the unspeakable horror of having their sacred temple defiled, plundered, and destroyed. At the same time, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Josephus had rebelled against Rome in the first place. Clearly, he had issues with their foreign overlords. And so, he does use the opportunity to needle Herod, and part of serving as a reminder that Herod had also been subservient. So while Herod comes across erratically in Josephus, it's important to remember that Josephus had multiple motivations for writing the way that he did. But he wrote a lot, and he gave us a lot of detail. So, on balance, thank you, Josephus. And while much of his writing is moralizing, Herod had managed to keep Judea at peace. Had he caved into the carping from the nobility and religious leadership and rebelled against Rome, the results would have been catastrophic. Now, this is an oversimplification of events, and the roots of the First Jewish-Roman War are complex and out of the scope of this episode. But this does demonstrate the calculus that Herod was forced to consider over and over and over the entirety of his life and his career. Now, if you happen to find yourself in Rome, Go to the Arch of Titus in the Forum. On the sculptural program on the inner arch, you can see the carvings of Roman soldiers carrying off the sacred Jewish relics, including the great menorah. The plunder of Jerusalem went a long way to paying for the Colosseum. The pain and suffering of Judea is reflected in Rome's most iconic ancient monument. By contrasting the compliance of Herod and highlighting the benefits that this brought with the rebellion of a few decades later, Josephus was reminding the world of the wrath of Rome and the folly of resistance. Herod had the foresight to understand the dynamics at play. His brutality, though, extended to his own wife and children. But, and this doesn't exonerate Herod, it was standard operating procedure for the Romano-Hellenic kingdoms and cultures of the time to liquidate any threat to rule. The same was true with their neighbor, the Parthians. In fact, given that the Parthian kings had multiple wives and concubines, there were often dozens of princes, many of whom would make a bid for the throne during periods of succession. The first act of some Parthian kings upon gaining the throne would be to order the systematic murder of all of their brothers. At least one, Orodes, seized the throne by murdering his father before turning on his brothers. So while Herod is inarguably brutal, even to his closest relatives, he was a product of his times. In the region and for that time period, power held through murder and brutality was much more common. I say this not to condone Herod's actions, but simply to contextualize them. His enemies had no qualms about destroying his monuments after he was gone. And what his enemies didn't destroy, the Romans would. The anti-Roman revolts that flared up after Herod's death brought about the cataclysmic Roman suppression. Not only did the Second Temple, Herod's crowning achievement, get obliterated, but so too did many of his other projects. He was a prolific builder. In fact, his construction projects were his greatest achievement and the cornerstone of the positive aspects of his legacy. Buildings designed to stand for an eternity barely outlived him. Inadvertently, this has deprived Herod of structures that could have improved how he was remembered. There remains the tantalizing possibility that we can learn more about Herod and his times. While most of his structures are in ruins and rubble, extensive excavations have not been conducted at many of the sites. Excavating these ruins could cast a new light on one of Judean history's most controversial figures. But given the religious and political dynamics in the area, such a promise remains unrealized. Still, Herod also contributed to or commissioned building projects outside of his territory. Architecture as a form of diplomacy was a novel innovation, and he deserves credit for that. It's long been contended that Herod was despised by those that he governed. This is cited as evidence of his megalomania. It's difficult to understand the sentiment of Herod's people toward him beyond the words of Josephus, but there's tantalizing clue about how Herod was viewed by members of the Judean nobility. One other thing that made Herod stand out from his predecessors was his distinct style and use of imagery. His clothing, his decor, his buildings, even his cups and plates, all reflected the polyglot blending of Judean, Greek, Roman, and other cultural influences that combined to create something truly new and distinct. Artifacts excavated from the reign of Herod display a consistent and enthusiastic adoption of Herodian style within members of the Judean nobility. If members of Judean society so eagerly emulated Herod's taste and style, then maybe they didn't hate him so much. Why consciously adopt a unique aesthetic of someone that you loathe? And it's worth noting, there seems to have been a lot of luxury goods in this period, some imported from quite far away. This confirms that Judea was actively participating in international trade networks and enjoying bountiful economic benefit as a result. These benefits did not solely accumulate with Herod. Rather, numerous members of Judean society enjoyed the fine wines and increased wealth that came with the Herodian prosperity. If so many grew rich and adopted the aesthetic of the king, then it's reasonable to suggest that the loathing against him could not have been universal. This adds up to an assessment that Herod was feared, maybe even despised by those closest to him. After all, his most horrific acts of brutality were directed against his own family. But anyone outside that immediate reach, there were likely personal benefits that came with his rule. He certainly wasn't universally loved within his domain, like, say, Cyrus, but it might be a stretch to claim the opposite, too. Not being hated by everyone is hardly an argument that someone is great, and Herod seems to be the least liked person we've covered so far. Occasionally, as I wrap up these episodes, I like to give the final words to scholars or historians who have spent considerable parts of their careers studying our subjects. I'd like to do so now. Archaeologist Barbara Burrell, who has excavated at important Herodian sites, elegantly summarized the dualities that Herod had to navigate. She said, quote, as king of Judea from circa 424 BCE, he had to reconquer his own kingdom, rule hostile as well as friendly populaces, and balance alliance with the Romans against defending and extending the borders of his domain. To accomplish all of this, he built prodigiously, founding fortresses, palaces, and entire cities, and endowing architectural and cultural projects even outside his realm. When you compare the pre-Herodian landscape with that of Herod's time, there is sudden, enormous growth in both urbanism and public architecture, and the king was central to both. Close quote. He has been called Herod the Great, and certainly he was also Herod the Terrible. He was a paradox, and certainly one of the most complicated people we've covered in this series. After more than 36,000 words of writing contained in these episodes, I still can't quite figure him out. But maybe together, we've gotten a little closer to figuring out who Herod was, and why some people seem to like and others seem to despise him so much. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'm grateful that you did. On the next one, I'll be spending a few minutes talking about this series and where it may go from here. Until then, just know that if you're listening, I think you're